Thank you everybody for coming. First of all, before I forget, I did it before, but I would like to do it again. As I said, it's a pleasure to be back in Buffalo. As you know, I'm often back here and feels like home for me. And I would like to thank everyone in the school, from the dean, the former chair Omar, and the actual two co-chairs, Corinne and Joyce, Hadas, and everyone who has helped to organize the seminar first and this exhibition and symposium tonight. As you know, this is a symposium dedicated to the legacy of Reyner Banham in Buffalo. The title itself comes from an interview that you find at the UB archives in North Campus that he released when he was just arrived in the city. And the first sentence is something he said at the time. And I found it really in the mood of Banham and with the joyful also twist. And as a kind of good title for the years he spent here and the legacy he left. This is an exhibition, as I said before, that is part of a wider exhibition project that is titled Reyner Banham, a set of actual tracks, that intends to develop a set of exhibitions with different contents in every city. And many of these cities are cities where Banham lived and taught and made research. As Buffalo now, and in the future there will be possibly and probably London and LA. And this be the first chapter in Rome that was a kind of test exhibition. The image you see comes from another document that you can find in another very secret archive, that is the House of Hadas. And I think already in this first slide there's a kind of duality of sources when you make research. There are official sources, ones that are available to everyone asking access and that are overtly there, and some other ones that you find just being on the ground and asking people and talking to people and revealing what you would like to work about. And this is also how this symposium was built in a way, because I was telling us my interest about doing something on Banham, since I knew that she was and she's an expert about British architecture after the war. And I knew she wrote a piece on Banham and photography, or she was engaged with that, and she will talk about it later. And she also told me that I didn't know at the time that Curt was making research about Banham and fieldwork especially. And this is again a way of developing work through just talking with people. And then we have Bonnie here that most of you know, that used to collaborate with Banham when he was here, and that had the chance to meet the both of us, the three of us, sorry, before. Now we'll say something super quick that maybe many of you know, but I don't take it for granted. So Reyner Banham was an historian of art and architecture, even if he often described himself as a journalist more than an historian. And maybe we can go on this back later. And he trained, first of all, as an engineer, and only after that he went into becoming an historian. And this, I think, is something that is also made him a kind of unique historian in this sense. You see here the cover of his first book, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age. That was the result of his PhD dissertation with a very famous historian, Nicolaus Pevsner, that probably many of you know. Then there's a few years later, the Guide to Modern Architecture, the New Brutalism, since Banham was friend of many of the, let's say, new wave in the UK after the war, from Smithson to other very famous architects. The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment. And these are all books that he wrote while he was in London. At some point, he became, or he was also able to travel to the US, and he was particularly intrigued by California, by Los Angeles especially. And this is also the place where he learned to drive. that I guess was useful also in Buffalo, even if Bonnie told us that he used to ride a bike and you were aware of his safety usually, but he was still alive after he left. Age of the Masters, which is another book on modern architecture. Megastructure, Urban Futures of the Recent Past. That is a book dealing with a very important trend in the 60s from Japan to US to Europe. Another book that you probably know very well, Buffalo Architecture Guide, which was a book that funnily somehow probably the person that was the one who really made it happen, Mary Banham, the wife of Banham, is not in between the authors. This is something some of you, later I leave some here in the catalog. I made an interview to Roger Conover, who edited the book for MIT Press, and I asked him why she was not there, and he said it was merely kind of standard for editorial activity, but I think it was kind of wrong in a way. Design by Choice, which is a collection of essays he wrote on design. And then there's books as the one on LA that he wrote while being in America, and especially this book when he was based in LA, especially, and in California, in Santa Cruz, sorry, that deals with the American deserts. That was one of his great passions while he was here. And lastly, the last book he published, Concrete Atlantis, that is obviously a result of his stay here in Buffalo. I went very quickly through it, but I think if some of you never read anything about him, I think you have a wide range of topics from which to start from. Something very important about Banham also is the fact that, as I said before, he described himself first of all as a journalist, and he wrote more than 700 articles for different magazines. New Society is probably the one where he published the majority of them, but there's a very diverse set of publications also in this case. Here you see the cover of an issue where there was a very famous article that he wrote along with Barker, Peter Hall, and Cedric Price. That was somehow a way of importing an American way of non-planning, as you might find in Houston maybe, especially to the UK. That was a kind of provocative aspect. Something very important, I think, for his biography, his life, was the International Design Conference in Aspen that he attended for many years. And that was an opportunity he got to Aspen, Colorado, as you know, that he got to come nearly every year to the US and know people that finally he met again here. Downstairs, there's something we tried to do that was also to represent graphically the network of people that Banham was in contact with while in Buffalo. And that document also is the result of another archival document that was this set of Rolodex papers, slides. So for who's too young, a Rolodex, I discovered that also later. It was a kind of agenda from the 70s that you had a kind of rings and all of the names that went back and forth. So the thing was taking this physical document and translating that into a synthetic diagram. Then Banham is also, I think, a super fascinating, but also a kind of slippery figure in the sense that compared to other historians, he was also a very cool guy in a way, okay? He was riding this foldable bike, and Brian has a picture in his office. You can knock his door and look for that, or you can find it online easily if you want. And then already when he was in London, he was producing radio programs and television shows, especially for the BBC. This is probably the most famous one that you can find easily on YouTube. But there's also another one called The Roads to El Dorado that was dedicated to the desert, and a couple of very tough to get other ones. And if you look at this video, you will, I guess, and maybe for students, it's probably maybe the most easily way to engage with him. You will see you will have many levels. Some of them are very playful and very pop in a way, but there's also a kind of depth that is given by his knowledge, as well as something that I think is what made me so fond of him is the fact that he was always looking at things that were mostly overseen at the time, or that people that would never think to be as a proper topic to discuss in the field of architectural history and discourse. So, as I said, this exhibition project is part of a wider set of exhibitions that is titled Reyner Banham, a set of actual tracks. That is an homage to what was, let's say, his kind of unforeseen or unwanted testament. That was a lecture that he was supposed to give at the New York University in '88 when he was given the chair of History of Architecture and Art in that school. And that was titled A Sect of Actual Monuments. And that lecture was a kind of tribute both to Pevsner, his former, let's say, master, and Henry Russell Hitchcock, that another historian that was for Banham a key reference. And in that text that I strongly suggest you read, you will see that Banham says that basically the knowledge about architecture is made of two sets of monuments. One is the ones that we physically found in the world, from buildings to landscapes, and the other one is some specific series of books that, for their importance in the history of architecture, they become monuments for our collective knowledge, in a way. A friend of mine here in Buffalo a few days ago asked me, a bit like pungent, so there was many things about Banham in this city. Why is your thing, or why is the exhibition different from the previous ones, or what is supposed to be different? And I think the attempt I'm doing is the one to, as I said before, to put together bits of archives, larger as a Getty or smaller ones, bits of knowledge. So I'm running a series of interviews to people who met him. I started with Druchet in LA, to Vittorio Gregotti in Italy, and I will interview more in the future. We interviewed Bonnie a few days ago with Curt, as well as trying to bring to the surface documents that were not public before, that were not shown, as well as I said, try to engage with his legacy also from a designer point of view, not just an historian. So from writing essays to producing visual materials that reflect on his legacy. Here's a few images of the first exhibition that was in Rome, that dealt mainly with the deserts, the work that Banham did in the deserts, which is compared in that case with work I developed in the frame of my research on the nuclear legacy in the US. And I also think that during these exhibitions there will be some of them where my work is maybe more present, and some of them where I think I make a step back, maybe like this one in Buffalo here, and it's more the work of the students and is a kind of curatorial approach. As I said, the materials are very diverse. You see here a drawing produced by one of the students that I think is probably one of the best visual materials that were produced during the workshop, the seminar, that reflects on the Darwin Martin house and the role these super large kind of pier columns they have in the house. As I was saying before, this is something that later Curt will describe more in depth, and Bonnie is here to talk also about it. When Banham came here with all the legacy of his teaching in the UK and all these new ideas that he brought from Europe, and I think also for him, someone before asked me if he was interested in grain elevators before being in Buffalo, and as far as I know, the answer is no. That he was asked to write a review for a book on American utopias. So he was driving from Buffalo to West Seneca, to Amana Place, where the Amana community used to be before moving to Iowa, if I remember well. And on the way there, he took a fast look at these monuments of American industry and commerce. And after that, he started his research on the subject. So obviously, all this work was also a result of this new interest he had at the time. Just briefly again, downstairs in the exhibition, we see the work of the students that, as I said, they have been asked to work in this kind of 10 by 100 miles rectangle that spans from West Valley in the south to Toronto in the north, in the sense that they could engage with a region that I discovered when I came here as a Banham Fellow. And to me, it's a very powerful region, because you have the same friend the other day, he asked me why Buffalo is so strongly related to Niagara Falls, no? And as I was saying, it's a region where in a few kilometers you find, I would say maybe every possible subject you might investigate as a designer or as a historian. You range from waste to pollution to untouched landscapes, architectural masterpieces, huge infrastructural works, and so on. So I think it was a great opportunity, and this is what Banham used to write about, basically everything, from potato chips to dams, no? So I thought it was an extremely appropriated area that someone would study in relation to Banham. So now I leave the word to Curt, that he will introduce himself, I would say, but he's actually a PhD candidate at Princeton University, used to be a Banham Fellow a couple of years before me, I think. Then Hadas will speak, that I guess you all know her. He's a professor of architecture and history of architecture here at UB. And then we have Bonnie Foit-Albert, that she's an architect, then later an engineer and a surveyor, if I got it right, during the years that studied a bachelor's at Cornell University, started from the late 50s, and then she opened her own office. It's a very interesting story that maybe also after the talk she can speak about. And she was most notably collaborator of Banham when in the 70s he was teaching here. So we have also, what I really like, we have different generation of scholars here that can also have a very different angle on Banham, because I think that's the same in Italy for figures as Rossi or Tafuri, and so I think the one who met them have a kind of approach or a kind of way of thinking about them that it's strongly related to biographical reasons and for sharing the same time in life. This is the case of Bonnie, in this case of Banham. But then next generations, I think they have also more freedom in taking different angles at looking at this heritage.
So thanks, Ludovico, for organizing this and bringing me here. I was here for another Banham Symposium discussion that Hadas had organized a few years ago, and it's always nice to be back in Buffalo. I think like Ludovico, Buffalo also feels like home to me in some ways, so it's always nice to come back. So today, I'll concentrate on two forms of writing, the field note and the biography, that Banham made use of for field work about buildings in Buffalo and elsewhere. In books such as A Concrete Atlantis and Scenes in America Deserta, which Ludovico just told us a bit about, Banham wrote in the vein of field notes, using precise, dense description of buildings and places that was gleaned from fieldwork. So especially in A Concrete Atlantis, Banham wrote first-hand accounts of Buffalo's industrial architecture in order to critique narratives about the history of modernism that were penned by its very own protagonists, including Walter Gropius, Siegfried Giedion, and Le Corbusier. But his teaching and use of fieldwork methods at UB and other schools subsequently led to other inquiries apart from the stated arguments of A Concrete Atlantis and other books and criticism, which I will explore now through course assignments and documentation associated with his teaching at UB and UC Santa Cruz specifically. So during the summer of 1977, Banham, his students, and Bonnie Foit-Albert, who, as Ludovico has mentioned, was an architect and faculty member here, which was what was then called the School of Architecture and Environmental Design at SUNY Buffalo. This group set about into the Larkin Complex, a series of daylight factories that survived Frank Lloyd Wright's infamously demolished administration building for the Larkin Company. So during an intensive 3-week summer course titled Buffalo, the Industrial Heritage, Banham, Foit-Albert, and other school faculty convened a series of seminars and fieldwork visits to draw and photograph the lesser-known Larkin factory buildings. So as a precursor to Banham's chapter on daylight factories in A Concrete Atlantis, their research involved field-based observation in order to establish the facts of buildings that Banham felt were overlooked by existing histories of modernism. So the practice of making field notes was a vital part of the group's observation of the Larkin daylight factories. Bonnie Foit-Albert assumed responsibility for teaching field note taking, which was ostensibly a class in survey methods. So as part of their pedagogy, Albert authored a document of procedural notes that outlined the scope and content of their fieldwork, titled A System of Observation, which is shown here. This is the first page. The full document is downstairs. So learning from her experience as an environmental designer and also from shadowing her father, who was an architect, Foit-Albert elevated the technical objectives of an architect's site survey to a system, one that could be repeated and corroborated later. She explained to me, for instance, that the purpose of field surveys was to generate information for the planning of a building's reuse and adaptation. So according to Albert's procedural notes, the objective of the survey was to evaluate a building by dividing it into a series of categories. A lot of this will sound familiar because I think some of these things, which were in some ways quite new to architectural education at the time, have also in some ways become part and parcel of how many people now teach. So the procedural notes ask the participants of the survey to proceed from a series of impressions about the nature and use of the building that were based on experience, but subsequently instructed the reader of these directions to corroborate their impressions and assumptions with the historical record. From there, the fieldworker's task was to analyze a building according to a number of categories and subcategories, such as what she called environment, including access, services, and vegetation, gross external observation of the building, including the overall dimensions, windows, changes in the building and construction materials, doors and windows, utilities, the roof, basement, and so on and so forth. So Albert's system presumed that the building was already a system with components that were shared and thus comparable in a way to other buildings. So when written down as notes and drawings in the field, students realized Albert's categories through provisional layered forms of notation, such as what we could call a field note picture here. So student field notes were comprised of a series of measured drawings with written notation on them, collapsing descriptive writing and drawing into a single space. For instance, an unattributed drawing from a series of field notes about the Lawrence Warehouse Company building show a hand sketch plan that included measured distances between architectural elements, programs such as a loading dock, bays, and a chimney, as well as ventilation ducts. So the overall effect here is a profusion of information with architectural lines, call-outs, and text, which all compete for attention. Because its lines and notation flicker in and out of legibility, the drawing would have likely only been fully meaningful to its author. And in some ways, in this way, almost like an anthropological field note, in which someone else reading it might not fully understand because of the shorthand it would use and so on. So the unfinished quality of the drawing suggests that it would have been used to inform another more formal drawing made afterwards, maintaining a distinction between the gathering of facts and their interpretation in a different time and place from that of the field, in this case, the classroom. So at first glance, the use of field drawing as a memory aid, which is, I think, what's happening here, harkens back to histories of architectural sketching, such as Le Corbusier's sketches of his travels in the Mediterranean. But the drawings of Banham and Foit-Albert students were neither a diagram nor a sketch, nor were they intended to be abstracted into ideas about form, surface, and space, as in the case of Le Corbusier's notebooks. They were rather a series of facts and categories of information that were gathered for the production of more formal measured drawings. So, given the fragmented and provisional quality of their documentation, how was visual evidence, how was all of this supposed to be assembled and put actually back together to be made meaningful in a way? So Bonnie informed me that Banham took a back seat in some ways to their field surveys, however involved he may have been, though the attention of her survey to visual detail fit well with Banham's pursuit of what he once called concrete facts about buildings. His syllabus for the course and his writing about Buffalo prioritized the narration and comparison of facts and images over their categorization and integration into a system. So a schematic syllabus for the class titled Documentation illuminates, I think, Banham's emphasis on visual comparison. This is also, I think, pictured downstairs if you want to inspect it more closely. So Banham made use of visual comparison to broaden the boundaries of what a field note constitutes, I would argue. So under the subject of architectural photography theory, which is the second category there, Banham included two books that juxtapose historical and contemporary images, including the Functional Tradition in Early Industrial Buildings by J.M. Richards, which was from 1958, and Observations on American Architecture, published in 1972 by Ivan Shermayev, who was really a graphic designer. So you can see here two spreads which I think illustrate what I'm talking about in terms of visual affinities and comparisons across very different moments in history, the nuclear power plant and buildings from the English countryside. So when applied to Banham's fieldwork with students, the two books' almost singular reliance on visual affinities emphasize the primacy of visual recognition prior to historical analysis of existing documentation and discourse about a building that Banham himself or his students would have done. So, but noticing a visual cue and otherwise recognizing something was necessarily premised on a familiarity with something prior. So in A Concrete Atlantis, Banham referred to his acts of recognition as what he called a double vision, a sense that every act of seeing was haunted by a prior image. He likened this to how a religious pilgrim returns to a holy site again and time and again, suggesting that Banham understood the field note as something akin to a pilgrim's diary. So when writing of daylight factories and grain silos in A Concrete Atlantis, for instance, he wrote of how they reminded him of Egyptian and classical architecture. This is there throughout A Concrete Atlantis. Or how he assumed the vantage point of earlier observers, including the architect Eric Mendelsohn. This is his photograph of the Washburn-Crosby grain elevator. So subjects of student-made photography in the 1977 summer course echoed Banham's journeys in the field. A number of images from the Larkin Day exhibition, which happened after the summer seminar. A number of images taken by student Joseph Hrivniak, which are shown here, showed a brick stairwell and railing from both the position of ascent and a close inspection of its brickwork. So stairwells comprise, it's worth remembering here, an important point of confluence for Banham's own concerns with history and fieldwork. In A Concrete Atlantis, Banham recounted walking around Gropius's famous Fagerswerk building. According to, quote, what he called the propagandists of the international style. He accused the propagandists of the international style of limiting their knowledge of the building to photographs. Here Banham asserted that first-hand observations revealed that Gropius's building, claimed by Pevsner and others to be a starting point for modernism after its pioneering phase, which in some ways was the version of architectural history that I received as a young student in the late 90s. In a sense, he was saying that actually, if you get close to the Fagerswerk building, it was in fact not quite modern. So he describes in A Concrete Lannis his descent into the building's basement, which is pictured here. Here we see where he starts to walk around and then what he discovers down below. So he writes that he was reminded of a handrail of industrial steel piping with one minor distinction. And he says, quote, "Their ends, beyond the last upright at the newels, are wrapped around in fulsome Art Nouveau or even Victorian spirals." So again, this building is what he would say is not quite modern. So small moments like these, I think, showed Banham's concern for a history of modernism. His unfinished book on high-tech architecture, had it been published, intended to make explicit how industrial architecture comprised an alternative history of modernism, leading up to high-tech architecture in the 1980s. In published writing, he persistently emphasized the visual appearance and construction of buildings over their occupation by people. As Hadas has noted in her essay on Banham's use of photography, Banham chose images for A Concrete Lannis that showed buildings without people and moving machinery, when in fact some of the grain elevators were still operational at the time that Bonnie and Banham would have seen it. But images and books from the Fieldwork course and subsequent exhibitions show an explicit attention to the ongoing life of buildings, and this I found very interesting about the archive of both their work and the exhibition. Photographs from the Larkin Day exhibition that followed from the seminar juxtaposed images of the Larkin complex's structural details and exterior with historic photographs of an occupied factory that was full of life. Off the record, Banham liked to speculate on the life of the buildings that he and his students explored. So according to Bonnie, very interestingly, Banham liked to stand in the spaces of daylight factories and grain elevators and tell stories of their life, recounting how their spaces were inhabited and used alongside narratives of their construction and design. So in a sense, storytelling reanimated what otherwise lie dormant in the ruins of post-industrial Buffalo. So besides the daily life of the factory, Fieldwork elicited another definition, therefore, of a building's life. Student drawings portrayed traces of adaptation and change, noting, for instance, where new bricks had been introduced to a facade, which is shown here in this image. Other images of their fieldwork portrayed Banham and his students scrutinizing the holes in the walls and floor of factory buildings, or straining their bodies to inspect small details, such as here. While their inspection of holes and structural decay were taken as an opportunity to learn about histories of construction that modernist polemics had glossed over, they also drew the group up close to the building's material life. This is one of Bonnie's pictures of Banham inspecting one such hole. So did such encounters lead to an empathic reanimation of the past, of a building's construction and use, which actually some students referred to in their reflections on the course? Or did they lead to an analysis of a building's ongoing change, this kind of contemporary life of a building? So with these questions in mind, Bonnie, Foit-Albert, and Banham inaugurated a one-year-long interdisciplinary program at SUNY Buffalo called Building Life Cycles. This was around 1977. Advertised to a range of possible students, including conservationists, historians, neighborhood organizations, and community design services. Think of the scope of that. The program's poster proposed that its research would encompass, quote, the complete biographies of individual buildings and building types, from, quote, the first gleam in the client's eye through the processes of design, construction, commissioning, occupation and use, maintenance, alteration, reconstruction, sale, recycling, and ultimate decay and demolition or preservation as historic landmarks. This is really the totality of a building's life. So the building biography, as he called it, struck a different chord from the priorities of Banham's writing and fieldwork. It did not imagine the building as a ruin, nor did it reckon with the images and words of modernist predecessors. Developed during active fieldwork by Banham, Albert, and their students, the concept of the life cycle suggested a clear beginning and end, after which the cycle would, in a sense, start again. So, to conclude, I want to show an assignment that Banham undertook after leaving Buffalo, pictured here. So student assignments from his classes at UC Santa Cruz, where he taught after leaving Buffalo, proposed a somewhat different approach to the study of a building's life cycles than the program at Buffalo, using historical narrative to tell its story. In an assignment for a class about a class titled Architectural History Fieldwork that Banham convened in the Art History Department at UC Santa Cruz in 1984, Banham instructed his students to imagine the decline and what he called, quote, the decline and fall of a building, which was, of course, a kind of cheeky twist on the idea of rise and fall history. So he provided students with a graph to the left of the page that sprawled out on the side, which showed the, quote, changing resale value of a hypothetical building, the actual value of which was up to the students' discretion and imagination. It could be dollars, rupees, it could be doubloons, whatever. So students were then instructed to imagine a 5-page biography for the building that explained its variations in value, including changes of use and public perception, alterations to its structure, and, quote, disasters, while keeping its site and scenario within reasonable distance of its typology. So he said, quote, no gilding the columns of the porch of a tract house. So from there, Banham clarified the stakes of the exercise. You may use, he said to his students, any narrative technique from janitor's logbook to strip cartoon or Gothic romance that seem appropriate to your chosen structure and its site. But the story should start by establishing the nature and location of the building, e.g., the, quote, last gasp drive-in at the junction of Polluted Creek Drive and the Dan Forbes Parkway was consumed by giant oak moths over the weekend of October 24th/25th, 1981. And the events described should correspond to the chronology established by the graph. So not a lot is known about the context of this assignment, but it left me thinking, was the assignment a warm-up exercise before fieldwork or a cool-down after a day in the field? To kind of get students in the practice and habit of writing. In a sense, this way of thinking about fieldwork also is writing work, that the two things are intensely involved in each other. So either way, Banham's assignment proposed a role for narration in fieldwork, breaking from the historian's voice into different vantage points, be it a star-crossed lover or a building janitor. So at first glance, the exercise seems to place the historian in the middle of the action, in full spirit of the mission statement for the Building Life Cycles program here at SUNY Buffalo. The program proposed that historical writing and fieldwork collaborate with other concerns about the ongoing life of a building, positioning the historian alongside other stakeholders, including neighborhood groups and conservationists. So in a sense, its authors, in this context here, were multiple, and written from different vantage points, opening up historical writing to other perspectives than that of the historian. In a sense, loosening the historian's kind of grasp and authority in a way. So in asking students to write its story, Banham hinted that the biography of the building was still being written, the line of the graph continuing here in perpetuity. So in a sense, writing summoned forth memory, composing stories out of what a student might have imagined a building to look like or how it might change. So we might recall here Banham's irrepressible déjà vu, that when he saw something, it was always something that he had seen before. So was fictional inscription then also an act of noticing, of constructing a new image of buildings based on prior images and visual cues? Was it a photographic form of writing? So whatever its chronological constraints which were required of students, the assignment hinged on flashes of memory and might even have required photographs, books, and magazines for help. Imagine students like running to the library looking for inspiration in books and magazines and so on. So writing on a blank page with a skeletal diagram at their side, Banham challenged his students to fill out visual description based on what their memory conferred. So as the discipline returns to the building as a locus of disciplinary values and history, something I think many of us have experienced as recent teachers, both of history and design, to me, assignments such as these provoke a series of untimely questions. So when returning to buildings, what do we actually return to? Here the building is in a sense almost disappeared and remains only as a narrative. So does fieldwork about buildings reinforce the authority of the historian or the architect's voice when accounting for a building and its historical significance? Or does fieldwork splinter the historian's voice into a polyphony of actors and historical fragments? As critics of history writing and anthropology such as Hayden White and James Clifford have argued, both of whom, just as it should be said, I think, taught at UC Santa Cruz at the same time as Banham. Banham was also part of a larger moment. So we can of course take Banham for his word about the role of fieldwork in writing an alternative history of modernism, in a sense that that was its purpose. But I wonder if Banham's fieldwork and his educational collaborations with Bonnie Foit-Albert open up other possibilities for history and criticism, the likes of which were articulated not in his books per se, but in teaching, such as in programs like the Building Life Cycles program at UB. So, thank you.
Off the cuff, I'll just say that I came to Buffalo because Banham did. It's true. When I was offered the job here, I thought I could take a job in a place. I worked on British modernism after the war. It seemed to make sense to me. And I thought, well, Banham was here for 4 or 5 years. That's how long I'll stay. Some of you know that that is a joke. However, I was offered a job at Santa Cruz, which I turned down, so but that's a whole nother story. And I love that my house and its secret archive is coming to play and to light today, including Banham's Rolodex, which John Biss gave to me when I arrived, along with a box of other assorted papers, which are now being contextualized and made interesting to others. And so I just want to say that Banham came here in 1976 at the behest of the dean at the time, Harold Cohen, who had taught with Buckminster Fuller and John McHale at Carbondale in Illinois. And Cohen had the idea of kind of gathering like-minded people from that time here in Buffalo and starting a kind of program which didn't quite, he didn't manage to get Fuller here, for example, but nonetheless, he did attract Banham for a while. And then Banham, of course, mostly due to the fact that at least to hear Mary Banham talk about it, his wife, moved to Santa Cruz because of the weather, because Mary it was hard for her to get around because she had a prosthetic leg, and the snow caused her a great inconvenience. And so what I really want to talk about today is kind of the implications of what Curt just talked about, the implications of the way in which Banham taught and worked and produced history. And so I'll start by saying that the history of architecture, it still needs to be said, right, is not a neutral pursuit, all right? It has a lingering aura of archival detachment, but it is still a political act. And the deployment of architectural history in Buffalo, an industrial city or a post-industrial city where the sort of longue durée of fiscal and racial and ethnic ghettoization has kind of stranded some 30% of the population below the poverty line still, right, demonstrates also how scholarship about a place can also be used to reify segregation. At the same time as the kind of co-option of cultural capital by politicians, by developers, is easier to identify, right? It's less clear how the historical discipline plays a role, or how it might be redirected to actually stem what might be seen as a tide of spatial injustice. And so the contrast between the sort of nitty-gritty aspects of the Buffalo landscape and the abstraction of architectural architectural history into a kind of aesthetic discourse was a project that was begun by the historian Reyner Banham when he was here between 76 and 1980. And that project, with its hints of a kind of alternative course for architectural history, remains still to be finished. So I feel like Banham began a project that we have a kind of responsibility still to continue or to see through in some way. So professional historians of Buffalo's built environment have traditionally followed one of two trajectories. Right? The dominant one tends to amplify that which we already know about the city during the period when it had the ability to attract eminent, prominent American architects to build structures that were significant enough to be considered as pivotal in the development of their oeuvre and also of modern typologies. But the alternative course embarks at the other end of the built spectrum, a kind of compiling of a scholarly case for lowly buildings of industrial architecture, that which of course has a rich heritage here in Buffalo. And this second trend was one which gained momentum from Banham's teaching and his publications in Buffalo, and not just A Concrete Atlantis, but also the articles that he wrote during his time here. And it is predominantly focused on this very conspicuous collection of mostly defunct grain elevators that Buffalo has an incredible collection of, and also of daylight factories. And while you know, the silo, and in any of its material iterations, is not a local product, the upright conveyor belt that was outfitted with scoops that was used to hoist the grain from the hold of a boat and deposit it at the top of a storage facility was said to have first been assembled in Buffalo by Joseph Dart in 1842. And the mechanical apparatus, of course, displaced the labor of stevedores who had hauled the grain on their backs to out of the holds of ships. But humans were slow, they were unpredictable, sometimes they drank, and agriculture was a big business. And so the grain elevator, as a kind of vertical configuration of mechanical apparatuses, as it came to be called, greatly expedited the flow of grain from the Midwest to the marketplaces in the East. And this is the short version of the story that Banham wanted to tell about the grain elevator. And all of the images that I'm showing today come from either Banham's own collection or were taken by Patricia Bazelon for Banham for A Concrete Atlantis or with him when they were doing research. Except for things like this, which obviously come from other books. And so the purest rows of concrete cylinders also, of course, suited the needs of European modernists, especially after the publication of Towards a New Architecture in 1923, when Korb famously used these structures to illustrate his assertion that our eyes are made to see forms in light. And Le Corbusier's conclusion was that the inferior work of American architects should be passed over in favor of the honest labor of engineers in order to extract the new principles for a new kind of architecture. And so the fact that these forms had been generated by subjugating grain, right, to the needs of transshipment, rather than sort of recourse to the bygone conventions of composition, purified them from the contamination of style. And accordingly, these structures that were considered pedestrian, and still considered pedestrian by most people, right, were elevated from a kind of mechanical contraption to a generator of an aesthetic doctrine. In other words, this low form of building became architecture. So the arc of architectural history has positioned Buffalo within a framework of a national and even an international discourse in which value has accrued through an affiliation with and a cultivation of aesthetic discourse. So given the visible ways in which historical research has been put to work, why has it been so hard? Say, for example, the saving of, I'll just be blunt, something like the Martin House renovation, right? The way history is put to use there is to create around a particular project and around a certain neighborhood, it creates a value in a particular neighborhood that already had a value that was recognized. So when history is used for that kind of work, right, how does one use history or think of the enterprise of history as a project which doesn't already fall easily into the way in which the urban fabric is already segregated? So for one thing, architectural historians are still trained to scrutinize singular objects. For the most part, that's how we're taught. We look at buildings, and what falls outside the purview of what is rendered, is rendered invisible. And more damagingly, sometimes it's dismissed as mundane by established academics, and then the next generation of scholars is trained in that way. There are, however, uncommon figures, such as Banham in the field, whose body of work provides an exception to a methodological rule. But when people outside of Buffalo think about Banham in the American context, they usually think about his writings about the desert and about Los Angeles, his interest in arid landscapes. And he had a passion for that, no doubt. But in fact, Banham left his job at University College London for Buffalo, for a job in Buffalo, at least until family considerations necessitated a move. And it was in Buffalo that his work in both subject matter and in procedure first started to resonate outside of the echo chamber of the London alternative scene. So this displacement from the center, from the urban center, was, after all, Banham's comfort zone. He liked the discomfort of being decentered. And he had begun his career writing about subjects that had been marginalized. As Ludovico showed you the cover of his first text, which intentionally tried to restore the avant-gardes that had been forgotten or suppressed by mainstream modernism. And so this was his job, to look for historical blind spots. And whether he was exposing suppressed avant-garde voices, or whether he was musing about the impact of air conditioning, or exploring the implications of lingering at the periphery, he was championing the cause of information and digital technology, so early on, already in the 50s. He was including and promoting practices that positioned the provincial always as a viable source of knowledge. So when he kind of took himself out of what he would have considered to be the mainstream by engaging with his fascination with American popular and technological culture. So even before he came to America, the very fact that he was interested in Americanism was something which went against the grain of the intellectual environment of post-war Britain, the left-leaning intellectual environment of post-war Britain, and it caused a kind of friction. And so this informal tone of the bulk of his writing, which kind of takes on these topics, as well as the scope of the publics that he addressed in the various publications, including New Society, in which his essays appeared, they further compounded his emphasis on accessibility of the message. Banham was a kind of public intellectual. And so in subject matter and style, Banham provided an insider's model to the outside for those who were seeking to avoid what he conceived of as the conventional economy of knowledge. But most significantly was the belief that he had in the potential for history to be practiced in opposition to mainstream discourse. And this can be discerned in his writings from the very beginning of his career. And the capacity was rooted in his approach to documentation. And I think this should be evident from the care that Curt has taken to show how he taught here in Buffalo, but the various layers of documentation, which he saw as a mutable entity, to which the historian added yet another layer by adding another film of interpretation. And you can see even in the way he worked through the context sheets that he was dealing with, how he's kind of interpreting or choosing, why he's making specific choices, and he knows that he's consciously skewing the discussion. And Banham was an avid photographer himself. He was particularly interested in the subjective role that photography played in the construction of history. And he wrote about photography often. Unlike a drawing, photography could pose as a passive record, and it revealed itself rarely as a composition, that of course it truly was. And so Banham himself, for example, noted, as he put it, the veracity of the camera is proverbial, but nearly all proverbs take a one-sided view of life. We tend to forget that every photograph is an artifact, a document recording forever, a momentary construction based upon reality. So lest we think that the implications of this kind of elision of construct and reality were restricted, say, just to the realm of scholarly discourse, Banham also concluded that photography, as he put it, had strong moral claims to truth and objectivity for over a century, but has now established its manner of seeing as the currency of our time. And we come to think of the photographic experience as the equivalent of personal participation. So he's writing this, 60 years ago, which really has only become more true in the age of social media, where the need to document your participation in a thing through photographs has become quintessential. So Banham knew Buffalo's architecture first through photographs, and he realized that this gave him the perfect kind of fodder for looking at the problematic of photography, and it gave him a foil to expand on the dialectic of composition and experience. So when he started to work on a concrete Atlantis, US industrial building and European modern architecture, which he published, eventually came out in 1986, based mostly on his experiences in Buffalo. He targeted the representational means through which the buildings had already been co-opted. And it wasn't merely that the thesis of the book explored the aestheticization of what he called non-architecture, but the study itself was demonstrative of the generative practices of history. And given that the trade photographs of American industrial architecture had been used to substantiate claims of verisimilitude at the heart of the modernist agenda, then Banham, in turn, used his own book to read as a polemic on the uses of documentary distortion. So Banham described the use of visual information in foundational texts and himself contributed to the debate through his own photography, through the photography that he commissioned, and through his own writing. And the significance of documentation and manipulation of how it is to read is intrinsically bound up with how one comes to know about buildings and how that affects the information that they impart. The book demonstrates the practices and the processes that Banham employed to mediate between field research and in an antiquarian mode, as he would have thought of it, and the archaeology of photographic representation. So when he arrives in Buffalo, he's struck by the fact that these buildings are immensely physical, that they have a kind of a presence that could not be transmitted through the grainy reproductions that he had seen in modernist manifestos. And the difference between how those silos were understood through those images rather than through empirical experience leads him to reflect on the fact that the conduit by which the silos had come to influence the development of the style of modernism that had made non-industrial architecture an aesthetic was a photographic construction. And he thought of the trade images that the modernists relied on as posing as, of course, free of contrivance and a product of optical science, and he wrote about them this way. These images, the trade images, supposedly free from the elements of personal reflection and selection and interpretation that must inevitably infect any artistic rendering or even the traditional production by architectural draftsmen of finished drawings from field notes, the photographs represented a truth as apparently objective and modern as the structures they portrayed. And so A Concrete Atlantist, while it centered on the non-architecture of labor, it sparked an interest, right, in architectural tourists to these kinds of buildings because they had been inspired by the polemics of early modernism. And admittedly, Banham was fascinated by that angle too, right? He often wrote about, as Curt has already mentioned, putting himself in the position of, say, Eric Mendelsohn, who had come to Buffalo in order to kind of see what Mendelsohn saw and to kind of create to reproduce the view which was of course impossible from that time. But he also researched the mechanics of the silos, including the stuff inside, as you see in a photograph like this, the workings of the belts and the chutes and the pulleys, and the internal dynamics of these outwardly very stoic structures. So then in the seminars that he ran with his students, the students participated in the documentation of what Banham referred to as anonymous works of industrial nature. And then they performed the kind of work on these buildings that usually was reserved for the kind of architecture that had an author, that had even an illustrious author. So in addition to the evidence that his students collated, he then undertook a process of documenting the silos with his own Pentax SLR, and then he hired Patricia Bazelon to also take photographs after he had taken them and engaged with her in a discussion of angles and vantage points, mostly through Post-it notes, which they exchanged on contact sheets. So, as Banham described in the Architecture Review, he sat on the end of a massive I-beam that forms part of the chassis of the currently out of service #1 marine tower of the Standard elevator. And I can see almost exactly what Eric Mendelsohn saw when he photographed this scene 56 years ago. He could not have sat where I sit. The Standard was not built until 1928. In fact, the photo he took then cannot be repeated, even given the right width of lens and angle and exact standpoint, because the view is cropped on both sides by main and subsidiary structures of the Standard. And I think it's really interesting that he sees something in the field as a cropping, right? This isn't, he's not cropping an image, but he sees what he sees with his eyes as cropped, and he applies it to how the view has changed due to the accretion of building on the ground. So, of course, photographs of the silos had been manipulated in this way to great effect. Le Corbusier had famously whitewashed that image of the Buenos Aires silo, of its chain of pediments. You can see he took Gropius's image, which you see on the left, and he replicated it on the right in Towards a New Architecture, cleaned up the way he preferred it. And so Banham too practiced a kind of photographic correction of a different sort, which was in the spirit of what had been done. And so there are several contact sheets, for example, in the Bazelon archive that include requests by Banham to have images that Bazelon had taken in 35mm film to be redone in 4x5 format. And you might wonder why this would be, why he would prefer one format over another. Often the 35mm images are beautiful and capture a lot of detail. But one reason for the 4x5 format is the advantage is that it more closely approximates a two-point perspectival view. But it also means that the view at the perimeter deteriorates, so that the need for cropping became important. So indeed, the large format images that are used in Concrete Atlantis are significantly cropped, despite the fact that Banham almost never cropped photographs, generally. He usually produced them as they were. And he never cropped any of the 35mm ones, even when Bazelon suggested that he should. So overt manipulation and the practice of cropping away the undesirable leads back to the crucial point, right, that I started with, the varying costs of the historical frame. Banham resisted the clipping and trimming of images that were made to capture the gist of experience. But the most staged of the photographic types, the manipulations by contrast, from tampering with the format of the negatives to excising unwanted information, these were eligible for adjustment. By contrast, the annexation of photographs from one context to another, a kind of act of appropriation, was further decontextualized by the surreptitious corrections to the supposedly neutral images that were performed as an act of conceptual redlining. So while the bias of constructions that passed themselves off as pictures of reality was in itself, right, a subject that was worthy of meditation, the effort remained incomplete. Banham, for example, lavished a lot of attention on the mechanics that made up the silos, but he never attended in any deep way to, say, the invisible labor that was intrinsic to the working of the machine, whether it was galvanized in the building of the silos or the fate of those who worked in them. Because A Concrete Atlantis is still the story of a building whose history has been put to various ends. However, the adroit levels at which Banham demonstrated the kind of balance of the visual record and active participation in the making of history needs to be extended to other forms of spatial marginalization that directly impacts lived experience. Decentralized places and states can, if the opportunity is seized, offer freedom that is foreclosed at the center. And in my opinion, that is a project that is worthy of the endeavor. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I am so glad that we're bringing up Reyner Banham, Peter, and all of his work, because he was a great resource, I think, for this community, for the students, and of course for the buildings themselves. Because as you know now, we're going through Silo City, which is an accumulation of creating a theme, I think, that people finally realize is very beautiful here. I'm sorry, but I'm a Silo City person. My father, I just want to say this much, my father was an architect, started Foit-Albert, and believe it or not, he lived on the east side on Adams Street. He did watercolors of the grain elevators you would not believe. They're about this big. There's 6 of them, and to see the beauty, you know, of the combination of these buildings was just very, very, very nice. I wish I could have brought one of them today, but I didn't. But I think one of the very good things that happened to all of us with Banham was he took students out to the sites. It's one thing to talk and show photographs, but it's a whole other thing to take your students out to really appreciate the environment in which these sites are, what's happening there, and then the architecture that celebrates that or helps it in terms of grain elevators, etc. So we were very fortunate because he took us to places that many students, including me, hadn't been before but admired from a distance. So I think his book, Concrete Atlantis, if you read some of it, when Eric Mendelsohn was here, evidently he wrote poetry called My Silo Dreams. And to think that someone of such importance would focus in on our architecture here in the grain elevators, I think is very, very wonderful. Ropes did too. So when Banham was teaching, not only did we go to the grain elevators, but we went to the Larkin complex, as you know, 701 Seneca. And it's a combination of buildings that were built, and then the facade was in the front, facing Seneca Street, was built over to connect all of the architecture of the various buildings. And Larkin Company was a very great manufacturer, has a very good reputation here. Now, if you were to go into the boiler plant building, it's amazing, and I would recommend anybody has the opportunity to go there. You won't believe it. You walk in, it was first built in 1896 and then added to in 1900, around 12 or so, 1912. It's phenomenal. You go into that building, it opens up, they have the boiler plant, but they have this extraordinary chimney that goes right up through the multi-stories and out. And it's just incredible. It was actually 80 feet of it were demolished, taken down in the 80s. I think probably to make the building a little easier to reuse. However, I haven't seen it. Has anybody seen it reused at all? They were going to put apartments in, I think, at some point. So when Reyner took us and the students out to those sites, we had a really legitimate, very feeling of touch for the buildings themselves. And the funny thing is, I talked to Tom DeSantis today, and he said one of the things that Reyner always said when he was taking the courses was the way to really hear, feel, see the building, you have to touch it in order for it to go into history. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that. But if I look at Reyner's work, that certainly is legitimate. He also had done some research on Lockwood Green. We went to daylight factories. He took us out to the Buffalo Belt and what's the others? Belt and Design, I guess. It's a manufacturing building that's actually on the east side of Buffalo. In doing this, taking students and others of us to the sites, he kind of, I think, for me anyways, glorified and enhanced and the sites that we're at, and I just loved it. The Bethune building was the Buffalo Meter building at one time. I believe was designed by Lockwood Green. Now it's the Bethune building. So we did a lot of research on not only the buildings here, but the history of them. And one of the things that Banham said was it's not that we have one point of interest. It's that the clarity of our buildings here in Buffalo and the districts make a lot of sense, and they are very, very well crafted, and they're still here. Now, what happens then is, and you can see it today, if you think about daylight factory buildings and so on, they are really now being taken over or developed by new developers because they see the idea of the daylight, the ease of interior design that you can do, segregating different rooms and so on. So I think Banham, in a funny way, also contributed to our respect for and recognition of the value of these buildings that were very well built in the time. In fact,
saying that Banham predicted the proliferation of loft structures in Buffalo?
I don't think he knew he predicted it, but I think it is happening. And in fact, I have to tell you, when I started my firm and when I was working with my dad before that, my dad used to take me out on these sites to see the materials that were going to be used. And you look at the 2x4s and 2x12s and steel. And then many decades later, the density and the what can I say, the density and the material value has kind of declined because now we have nominal, not actual, and we have some materials that are really not all that well developed for structure, for those kinds of things. So I just want to say that Banham was a gift to all of us, and he left, I think, a value that will continue on in Buffalo. Because we have the grain elevators, we have the daylight factories. They're being bought by developers and actually reused. And when Banham talked about building life cycles, that's, I think, one of the predictions he made that's really very good. We can adapt these buildings. They will go up, use changes, and then if they're in very good condition, or we appreciate it and keep them, they get redeveloped into another use. So it's kind of a life cycle that starts over and over and over again on many of the structures that we have here. And I'm so glad because, frankly, I love Buffalo. And I'm very addicted to our people, our place, our environment, everything.
Talk more about Richardson Psychiatric Hospital. And
What was that? What?
I know that after Banham left in 1981, and there's some documents in North Campus, you ran a class about the Richardson Psychiatric Hospital that it's today been turned into something else.
Right.
But already at the time with the students you were investigating its current condition at the time, studying its materiality and imagining possible futures for that building. And now nearly 40 years after that, the building came to new life, no? So that's something you were, in a way, it was a way of looking at things that you kept doing at the school with the students, and then, it became reality somehow, no? So if you want to say something more about Yeah, not just about the data factories like grain elevators, but also that other building, which is another
like
masterpiece
the
by a great.
design domino.
Yeah.
I don't know how many of you will know about the Richardson design mental health building on Forest in Buffalo. It's currently been adaptively reused. It's been a while since it was actually abandoned, and now it's Hotel Henry. And we used to go out to these sites, and when I take the students out to the site, Banham was wonderful taking students out to really see things. I would go to the Richardson complex, and we'd go through all parts of it, and the adaptive reuse of it took at least 30 more years to begin to do. And I think what's so beautiful about it is the interior spaces, the phenomenal thing of psychological history, mental health. And of course, do you know that Hayes Hall in this area was originally designed for poverty-ridden people? And we discovered when they did some excavation that, of course, it was then changed into a hospital, and they had a maternal hospital, maternal. It's just wonderful what we've done with the gifts that we've been given. And the other thing I think Banham has said in Concrete Atlantis is that areas like Buffalo, it's not just one point where the historic preservation, the beauty of life is, it's in all over in various districts. And so when you go, if you go to see the Henry Hudson Richardson building on Forest, oh my God, we call it the flock of geese, because it starts out with the administration building, then it goes male, female, large, small, small, smaller, and so it's shaped like this, and it's kind of, I think, a wonderment. Anything else? Did I cover it okay? Okay.
Related to the practice of fieldwork?
Pardon?
A question about the practice of fieldwork.
The process of?
The practice of fieldwork.
Oh, of fieldwork.
And the question is,
very important.
if you think the fact of being in a group or being alone, does it change it? Because I think it's a completely different experience. Practicing fieldwork alone in a building, so you are just alone yourself in a space, or you do the fieldwork with other people along with you. And this is something that we also experienced in the seminar, that the first days we were all together, and then the students, they went basically alone to the sites. So after your experience, what do you think changes being alone, doing fieldwork, or in a group?
What has it changed, Ben, are you saying? In terms of use?
If being alone, doing fieldwork, or in a group of people, does it change the way you do fieldwork?
Well, I think one of the wonderful things about what Banham did and what should happen today is we really do need to visit these sites and get into the history and do the field work. It's very, very important. As you know, there's some things that are happening today like lead-based paints and stuff like that. But that doesn't matter. It's really, I think, the ability to do the field work. And my father, it's funny, he would do surveying, and he taught me how to survey the sites. So you take the scope, you take the rod, and you try to understand what the topography is like. And I think Banham's ability to take us into these places and actually see the material, and actually, he also did research on the use and who were the tenants and so on. I think that's very important, because hopefully we'll bring that history forward, but in a different way, a recycled way. Did I answer you right?
Yes and no.
Tell me the no part.
Well, when you went from, sorry.
I'm sorry, guys.
No, it's okay. Did you learned fieldwork partly through your experience learning from surveying methods with your father, right? That was one thing that informed your own process. So what was it like for you with Banham to go out with a group of students and to actually do that as a large group of people? This thing that you had done in some ways individually, like what changed?
I think the beauty that he took us through, and I say beauty, only because if you visit the site and you're with the students are learning about the materiality of the use, how these could be redeveloped and why we should save them. And so I think that's very important. The field work is very, very important. And if you're going in the field, well, I'll have to tell you another story. We were working on the Richardson building. I sent one of my staff, Bob Garnett, went over there. And he went up on the roof of the Richardson complex. He was looking at the slate and the other roofing. And he hears the siren. It's cops coming by because they see him in a white outfit on the roof and they think he's going to do something bad, like jump. And so I think that it's important to see all these, but it's also important, you know, I like the idea of groups going to do field work. I think it's very important to do field work. It's not only about the environment, it's about the structure, it's about the materials, it's about what it means to the community. The community, I think, is very important of some of the recycling and the redevelopment of these buildings. You have to actually deal with context as well as content. So, did I answer it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Oh, it was so good to work with Banham. Oh my gosh, I can't praise him enough. And we lost him in 1980, but he was doing other.
Oh, you mean he left here?
Yeah, we didn't lose him physically, but we
Yeah.
did in terms of his presence here.
Right. So I think, is it okay, Bonnie, if we open it up to questions from the audience?
Oh,
No? I think we have about a half an hour for discussion.
You guys answer 'em.
So, okay. Do we need to pass the microphone around? Okay.
Go here. Oh, this one, okay, there's one. Here's another one.
I can talk loud.
It's for posterity. The video doesn't capture your voice well enough without a microphone.
Thank you. I had the honor of being here as a lowly freshman in 1978 when Bonnie was teaching with Reyner Banham. And you know, just as a fledgling architect coming from a small high school into a major university, I found the history classes in architecture a place of refuge. And my gosh, I had the opportunity.
Say that again? You found it what?
A place of refuge. And it made architecture romantic, which, you know, and passion. I mean, I had the opportunity not only of Reyner Banham, but Betsy Cromley, Jack Quinnen. I mean, talk about the triumvirate of historians, and it definitely influenced my path, you know, into architecture history preservation and what I'm doing today. But in fact, I worked with Bonnie on the psychiatric center when you proposed putting the Olmsted School there.
Oh, that's right.
About 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So
they were going to put
just a comment on how important I think Reyner Banham was to this school, to Buffalo, and personally to me.
Oh, thank you. I feel the same way.
Hello. So I'm curious if you could help us contextualize a little bit this notion of fieldwork, because I feel, at least for my experience within architecture school and practice, that fieldwork is a kind of intrinsic part of the process of learning. And I'm just curious if you could help us understand the context in which Banham was introducing this. Was this a novel thing, and if so, how did that kind of transform the pedagogy of that time?
Well, of course, the idea of traveling to architectural sites was part of the education of an architect, right, from the Grand Tour onward. So Banham was very conscious of the fact that there was this traditional way of viewing buildings and measuring buildings and drawing buildings, which he was trying to play off against, I think. So it wasn't that it was a new phenomenon, but that his way of engaging the buildings and understanding the documentation of the buildings as always partial, every document as being a layer of information that together forms a type of picture. So that's just to say, within the context of architectural history, in terms of methodological, if you're asking him, are you asking him methodologically where he fits in? You want to take that one, Curt, or?
I think, well, I mean, it's actually also, frankly, it's a question I've had. I mean, I think it was interesting for me to sit with Bonnie and talk about their experience of working together, because I don't think it was meant. I think I mentioned it very briefly, but Bonnie also had experience with your PhD, right, and your master's degree of looking from an environmental design perspective at. It was a study about autistic children and their relationship to the environment, and I was reminded of this when you were saying that the gentleman you were speaking to talked about Banham's idea of touching the building as being a kind of necessary component of fieldwork. I would say, Joey, that that's not something that would have been emphasized, for instance, when you were asked to do a mapping exercise, or when I was asked to do a mapping exercise as an architecture student, say like 10 years ago or something like that. I think that was something that was actually unique about this moment, and I think that you can see in both Bonnie's experience and Banham's experience of them coming at the idea of a kind of sensory engagement from, I'd actually say, different angles, but actually converging in a very interesting way. And I'm wondering, Hadas, do you know, was there precedent for that kind of sensory engagement? When I think of these earlier journeys of architects and the documentation they were doing, I think on the one hand of this scientific documentation that's aims at a kind of precision and truth value on the one hand, and the kind of idea of the Corbusian sketch, which actually moves away from that and actually moves towards the kind of towards quickness as a kind of momentary recording of something that he can return to and formalize in a way, but in a very loose sense.
Well, there's the haptic tradition, right, of haptic experience that comes into play from the German tradition of experiencing buildings, art through the other senses besides vision. So there's that.
And I would add something quickly to that, in that interestingly in the UB archive there is a letter from a student, which is in a sense I think almost something like a course evaluation, where she talks about this. She actually talks about, I think it suggested to me that Banham and perhaps Bonnie as well would have really articulated this as a objective of the seminar, that in actually, I think she mentioned touching the building, that it actually reanimated a process of construction, but also the kinds of people that were involved in that process. I mean, it kind of opened up in her own imagination as an individual this history through a kind of empathic relationship to a very material thing. So I think in the archive of this course, you'll also see that history that Hadas was just referring to, actually, which Banham himself was educated in.
Yeah, something more, maybe a bit different, but one, it's a kind of nearly funny thing, is that in Venice there's some history preservation professors, they even eat pieces of mortar to taste the amount of salt and that thing. So it's not even touching, it's like eating the building, no? Which is like an extreme, but it actually happened. To me, I think there's something that it's a bit different between the travel experience, what started as a grand tour and Le Corbusier did with the sketches. So it's like traveling as a kind of, either for holidays or for, you might call it work/holidays, no? What many of us do. But one thing is...
These were 3-year-long pilgrimages. They were not vacations.
No, but wait for that. But one thing is to go to one place once, and one thing I think is to return there often. And that's, to me, fieldwork. The first thing is not fieldwork. The first thing is I don't know, getting aware of the world, call it as you want, but once you go back to the same site in a different season, in a different time of the day, maybe in different ages of your life, if it's a place that you go often there, that's to me fieldwork. Otherwise, I think we are talking about different things, possibly, in a way. But
I would also add that if we actually expand the lens of fieldwork beyond architecture, I think it's yeah. Okay. I think it's also relevant to consider that in a discipline such as anthropology, so much of anthropology was actually written from afar until the 20th century with figures like Malinowski. So I think in some ways, I mean, one could write a kind of comparison between Banham and Malinowski, because in a sense their rhetoric was also about working against a kind of armchair academicism, where you basically read the reports of others who had gone out into the field, right? And from various moments in history, and you kind of construct your own narrative and analysis and version of history out of that, right? So it is something that happens in the 20th century in many different fields, which also seeks to kind of go out and to see things firsthand, which also comes with, a kind of an assertion of authority, right? That not just I swear I saw this, right? When you go back, but also I saw this, right? And that accords it a certain kind of truth.
But more than the seeing of it, I think, as an anthropology, is that when you see it and you record it, you change it. So the observer is not neutral. And I think that is what, we've been getting at today, right? That we affect, I mean, maybe it turns the architecture into lots. I hope not. That's the opposite of what I was trying to say. But, the reuse is expansive. Like what it means for a building to have a life beyond its program is much more expansive than what developers might imagine.
Right.
Just one more thing, and maybe as a designer than a historian, I think we shouldn't also think as designers that fieldwork is a sufficient act for us to design a good building. This it's not sufficient. There's a case for me which is very exemplary, which is the house Le Corbusier designed in La Plata, La Casa Cruce, which I think is one of his best buildings, and he never went there. So we shouldn't.
Go to the carpenter section either.
Yeah.
He often didn't.
So, but I mean, it's not said that fieldwork is sufficient to do then a good work, because I also think that you should, as they did at the time, you should also build your own fieldwork tools, and not always the same traditional fieldwork is good for every task you wanna deal with, no? And
what would you say? I'm curious. When you say that fieldwork is insufficient what was the word that you used exactly? I'm curious what you think. What happens beyond, or what's in addition? What is fieldwork part of in your view of design? What role does it play?
I'm just saying that, to me it's very important, but it happens to me that I often take part to competitions, or I design things in places I never went, or I just see through Google Street View or Google Maps. And we are also trained as architects to, I know it's tricky, but sometimes having a kind of detachment for places it's a surreal thing, but it brings even to better design sometimes, no? Because you don't have a kind of engagement. Sometimes being close to people, it's harder as a designer than to be totally a foreign guy, no?
But that's so interesting, because in a sense that connects with this, even like Banham's Banham's what you're saying also connects with this idea of the photograph is free of personal appurtenances and these kind of oppositions that are drawn, right? Like, but I think what's interesting in what you're saying, and I hear that a lot actually, is that we still work within these kind of categories in a way, when actually we're living in a moment when we're simultaneously very present and immediately here, but also our identity, our selfhood is literally broadcast around the planet in many ways.
Oh wait, you didn't sign the form yet, so we can't release your image of
You can't release my image, right? But that's actually, I think, really important, because the kind of ways in which our experience is mediated, whether we go somewhere or not, have actually changed very dramatically. So I think it's an interesting question for us now to think about what field work looks like in a context where, I think this question of what we're feeling, when even what we feel, this is something that the anthropologist Anna Tsing has made a point of recently. She calls it the art of noticing, right? And what she's asking anthropologists to do, and which I think we could even ask architects to do, is to notice very small changes in the environment. Because what she's trying to think about is how those very small, almost imperceptible things are actually indicative of much larger forces, of changes in the environment, of racial segregation, any number of things. So I think that idea could very well translate to a kind of methodology of fieldwork and architecture. And it might not mean going there to a place, actually. So. But I think what's nice about Banham is that what we're talking about today, it opens up so many of these questions for us that are still so pertinent.
I don't know. I wanted to thank for that talk. It was actually really interesting to hear all of your different perspectives. I don't know if this is working, but I know it's working. I can hear it. And it made me think about a lot of different things in relation to Reyner Banham. And something that you brought up, Curt, about this idea of every material image is preceded by, or I think this is Banham's idea, that every material image is preceded by a kind of ideational image or a visual image of something from before, and something that turns up in the writing so often. And I was thinking about this idea of the thing and then the skin around the thing, the buzz around it, which was so important for Banham. And before I came here, I was doing my Banham warm-ups, and I was reading this thing called Summa Galactica, which is Banham's review of not potato chips, but Star Wars. And so obviously it's a takedown, and he doesn't like the movie, and sort of he's saying it's a bit regressive, and Princess Leia is this like tragic virgin who can't seal the deal. But then a quarter of the way through, he takes a turn and starts taking down all of the reviews of Star Wars. And he's like, if people liked it, he's like, I don't know why this person liked it. And if somebody didn't like it, he's like, oh, they didn't like it for the wrong reason. And George Lucas is bad, but the Times of London Literary Supplement is like infinitely worse. And so I wonder if for you, looking at this, because it's an interesting way of working, to look at the thing, but then also be critiquing the critics. And it sort of, in a way, can put you outside of something while you're part of it. And so as you're doing this work around Reyner Banham, even with this exhibition or your seminars or your writing, I wonder, does that make him something that's resistant to study or something more fun to study? Or I just sort of wanted your opinions on that. Thank you.
resistant or fun?
Maybe those aren't mutually exclusive.
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, as some here know, I'm in the middle of a dissertation project which actually involves fieldwork. Very different from what Banham is doing, because it's actually more explicitly anthropological. It's actually a lot of talking to people. Like, where I would differ in some ways to Banham is that though I also look at what I learned from Banham is to take the physical thing seriously, actually, to not take it for granted, to get up close, this is something before I had ever read Banham I was already doing in research I was doing years ago in India, because in a context where there was no archive and not a lot of written discourse about some of the things I was doing research about, actually looking at a detail revealed, like a detail this big, actually revealed to me a lot about a history of techniques of construction.
Yeah.
So in some ways, when I learned more about Banham's work in the last few years, it was very uncanny in a way to see this. But something where I would kind of maybe differ from him is that I really like talking to people and hearing the way they make sense of the environment around them. So for me, it's not just about my role as a historian, as the kind of interpreter in a way, but I'm actually interested, much in the way I guess he's writing about all these other reviewers, I'm interested in, when I'm doing research about buildings, for instance, about what the other people who built it, live in it, et cetera, actually have to say about it, which might have a totally different agenda than my own. So,
I agree. That's, in itself interesting, but the one thing that I think that you're bringing up, who's, by the way, yet another Banham Fellow here was in our department, is Banham's relationship to criticism as a critic. He's a critic, and his critique of criticism, right, is very much alive, especially when he's writing in more popular vein. So for me, I mean, I don't know if I apply it exactly to my pedagogy, but I think about it. I actually do think about it a lot when I'm writing myself, or when I'm thinking about ways in which one relates to what others have already written about a thing. When you're adding your own voice to it, what is your relationship to the sea of voices that are out there contemporaneous with yours, or that precede yours, or are yet to come? So I think that consciousness for me, like the piece that you talk about, and happens else in other places too, which is kind of amazing. Even though it's as if Banham doesn't realize that he himself could be critiqued that way, because he's now entering the field in which he has, that he has set a light, right? So it's an interesting process of thinking through the role of one's role in creating cultural narratives.
For me, there's a kind of autobiographical issue that I'm a European, even if the English are a bit off Europe in a way, but there are still, I mean, culturally it's like that in a way, but
Listen.
I'm a European, and Banham was a European too. And I think, looking at the whole span of his life, that America played a big role in the way he researched and practiced. And the way he was working in London here changed. Some people say it's not so true, like his son. I spoke to him in London, but I think it was actually true. And for instance, I was talking to Vittorio Gregotti, with whom Banham and Rossi had a huge argument in the 50s. And I asked him, so why, when you became director of Casabella, why did you call Banham to work with you? And he was like, well, America changed him. And if we were on opposite sides, when we were in Europe, when he was in the US, he was a different guy. And in a way, America also for me has been the subject of my PhD dissertation. I went to very remote and weird places for the research. And in a way, Banham was for me as a kind of, as for him, Van Dyck or someone else was for the deserts. For me, it was a model of being a foreign in this country and try to look at things that are especially unfamiliar for us, because in Europe there's a kind of density that here you would never have, apart from few cities maybe, but in a different way. So to me, there's also a kind of a distance, silent dialogue with this work that maybe in my case is less written, it's more done through visual means, but it's a kind of not neutral engagement. Yeah, so it's nearly 8 o'clock, and as Hadas was suggesting, it's time to wrap the discussion. I'm really happy that what I said before, having different generations of scholars and professionals at this table, and I think it's very important to hear voices from different times in space, in a way, and to I think it's also important to have the opportunity to run individual research, as we all did in different places, and to meet, to debate, and to go out from here with an increased amount of awareness of what we're trying to do. Then the result might be great or not, Joey, I don't know, but I think, I hope this exhibition and this talk might help also the students not to take fieldwork as simply as tourism or taking some pictures with a phone while chatting, but about really thinking about, I think fieldwork can really be partial, like look at some specific issues that interest you or try to look at the bigger picture, but I think it should be something that we might deeply think about while doing it, before maybe, and also after that. Yeah.
I also just
thanks everyone for coming and for hosting us here.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I also just want to thank Bonnie for joining us today and for being with us, because it's such a wonderful opportunity for us to actually dialogue with the person who actually did this work. So the protagonist, yes. So how wonderful. And it's been really, I think we've all enjoyed our conversations with Bonnie over the course of a few years, and have learned a lot actually about a history which is both very specific to the school and to the city, but I think also has much larger ramifications, as we've been discussing. So thank you. Thank you so much. So, and thank you everyone, and thank you Hadas too for being such an encouraging presence for Ludovico and I and others who have expressed curiosity in this legacy of Banham. So thank you.
You're welcome.